Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here with Jennifer Robson from Carleton University, and she is one of these professors who's really good at the implementation side of policy and thinking about how that works. And so I figured one thing we would look at today are something from each of the three main parties that's going to be a challenge to implement, because I think those are things that we should be thinking about when we're reading the platforms. So Jennifer, where would you like to start?
So thanks for having me, and thanks for such a kind intro. Implementation. I try to look at policy ideas from the various parties. Sorry, somebody is trying to text me. I'm just going to end that there. And I try to look at it in terms of is this feasible, right? Like, does government actually have the tools and the ability to actually implement this? So I've got sort of three, one from each of the various parties that I think touch on different aspects of implementation. But I don't know, which is there a party you want me to start with?
Why don't we just go in descending order? So why don't we start with the Liberals?
Liberals, okay. So this one is actually an issue around implementation and in unintended consequences or policy impact, right? So the Liberals, as part of their package of measures that they've announced on housing affordability, have basically brought back to life a 1974 policy. I'm not joking. It's like it's a carbon copy of a 1974 policy for a home buyer savings account. And the idea here is that if you're not already a homeowner, you put money into this new dedicated tax preferred account. You get a deduction of they're saying 40,000 that goes into the account. And when you take it out to buy a home, you don't pay any tax on it. So
right, and I think the idea here is that you're not using your RSP for this like people are doing now.
Well, and I mean, they haven't said basically that this would, like, people could essentially do both, right? Plus, we also have tax-free savings accounts, which you don't get a deduction for, but you don't get taxed on when the money comes out. Right. And in all of these accounts, money that you earn in the account doesn't get taxed either. So I guess the challenge with the home buyer's account is a couple-fold. Number one, the problem of affordability, as I think everybody understands it, is that the people who are not already financially secure, who don't already have home equity, who don't have significant financial savings, are the ones that are having a really hard time getting a foot in the market, right? Like just buying a first anything.
Yeah.
And so that's the policy problem this instrument is designed to address. But because they've made it a deduction, right? And I don't know if in the print of the platform itself, it also says that a person, by the way, it's limited to people under 40. So, okay, right. Fine. Okay. Yes, people under 40 are less likely to own a home, although anyway, they're saying that people could save up to 100% of their incomes, right? Because of the size of the deduction. Now, by making it that generous, by making it a deduction at all, it means that people who have higher tax liabilities in a given year get way more bang for their buck out of this. So when you look at the evaluation of that 1974 policy, as I said, so it was on the books until 1980. I'm going to get this number wrong, or this date wrong. Mid-80s. It was canceled in mid-80s. And then we had a couple of years before that measure being able to withdraw from your RSP came in. Anyway, if you look at the evaluation of that policy, it was called the Registered Home Ownership Savings Plan. Yeah, it did actually accelerate the transition from rental to home ownership for people who used it. But most of that impact was skewed by people who were higher income and were probably going to buy a house anyway, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing too here is, don't forget, like, a big part of the housing affordability side has to do with inadequate supply.
Right.
So if you're doing more stuff to continue juicing the demand side, you're really...
It just drives up prices.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be some of the concerns I have about the home buyer's account. I mean, they didn't have to make it a deduction. You could have designed it instead to be income tested, not just age tested. They could have done something that said, okay, if you're a low income person, you put in money into this account, we'll actually match it, right? With like a savings grant, that kind of thing.
Yeah, they kind of do that around education. So
yeah, exactly. Like there are models out there already. Anyway, so the idea of helping people accumulate the financial capital they need in order to qualify for a down payment and mortgage insurance, sure, there is some sense in doing some of that as long as you're also increasing supply, but you just got to make sure you're actually designing the policy to reach the people that need the help.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah. So that's our first one. Right. Next one, I guess, would be the conservatives.
Okay. All right. This is another account-based one.
Okay.
This is the conservative plan to eliminate the federal backstop on carbon pricing, right? Where, as we know, if there isn't a provincial regime, then you get this carbon rebate.
Yeah, on your tax form. Yeah,
on your tax form, right? Which even conservative economists have noted actually leaves the vast majority of families who get it better off. So conservatives are saying they would do away with that. They would work with provinces to introduce personal carbon savings accounts.
Yes. Or like a carbon air miles kind of program.
As a matter of fact, they even specifically reference loyalty programs. They're a little wishy-washy in terms of they're saying like could be run by a consortium of companies. So it's not clear.
I remember when that rolled out and they were using Interac as an example.
Yeah. Or as you were saying, air miles, right? And so they actually rolled this policy out back in April, right? Not I'll go through my concerns with it, but back in April, they were acknowledging, as I understood it from media reports, and even some of the stuff I saw on social media directly from conservative MPs, hey, look, this is an idea. We haven't quite figured out all the details, but the details are still not there in their platform. Like there are no new details around it.
Yeah, it's been months.
Yeah. So the idea here is people get an account. We don't really know exactly how they would get an account. Remember, there's no master list of all Canadian adults. So like they can't auto-enroll people.
No, and right? we learned this firsthand at the beginning of the pandemic. Yeah. And there was no ability just to give checks to everyone.
Exactly. So it's not really clear how people would get an account in the first place. If it's being run by companies or a consortium of companies, well, they're not going to do this out of the goodness of their hearts. Like there has to be something in it for them. Yeah. And there are going to be some consumers that they're really interested in reaching, right? Like the ones whose information is high value. But low income people, like they're not going to be a priority target. So there's that issue. The other thing that's really weird is, do you remember a couple of years ago, you will remember this, Dale, there was the whole bun fight about StatCan saying on a pilot basis, they wanted to get bank account microdata right, on people's transactions so that they don't have to survey people to find out like how do you spend your money.
Yes. And it was all going to be and it was going to be anonymized, and there was no actual privacy breaches involved.
Exactly. But
people freaked out.
People freaked out and there was a hue and cry. The only way to make these carbon savings accounts feasible, right? The idea is like, okay, so when you buy gasoline at the pump, when you pay for your home heating bill, when you do, all those sorts of things.
All those things. But I mean, they also, when they rolled the policy out, were saying like, if you buy local food, you get it as well.
Right. Yeah.
So the amount of data you need to get that is enormous.
Totally enormous. And that's just to get the information coming into the account to figure out how are we crediting what you've earned. On top of that, there's this whole issue of, because they're saying that you could only use the credits in your savings account for like green types of purchases, right? Yeah. So now we've got to make decisions around what's green, what's not, right? The platform makes reference to things like a more efficient furnace for your home. What if you're not a homeowner, right? Like we need inclusive lists here, right? Yeah. Like a new furnace for you, Dale, is not very useful, is it?
No, not at all.
And I don't imagine you're going to be covering that cost for your landlord. Anyway, so there's that information issue coming into the accounts that I think is really problematic and kind of just inconsistent with some past conservative positions around privacy and information management, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue around information going out in terms of what could you actually use these credits for. And again, I come back to this issue. If this is all being managed by companies, they're not going to do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They want to be able to, like, that's creating a hugely valuable asset if we figure out the feasibility of this. And so if you're worried about the privacy of, your social media data, for example, this is creating a whole other set of potentially problematic privacy issues.
Yeah, and this is something that I kind of thought about as soon as that came out, because I've done stories before about there were some court cases around consumer data and privacy aspects related to that. And just like Air Miles doesn't do their program out of the goodness of their heart, they are hoovering up data. And this would seem to me to be like Air Miles on steroids. In terms of the amount of consumer data they would generate and be able to either sell to other parties or use for their own purposes if it's
Absolutely. And so this is basically the only way to do this feasibly is to tap into the Canadian payments data system at like a highly, micro targeted level. And if you can do that, holy mac, like you are directly observing consumer choices day in, day out. And that is enormously valuable information.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it's I think it was Chris Turner who was remarking on this yesterday on Twitter that this largely unfeasible implementation makes it unlikely that this is a serious proposal that they're using.
That's an interesting question. Was the point here to have something that was good enough to govern with? Or was the point to have something that was good enough to run with? I guess I come back to the issue that fundamentally election platforms are packages of policy proposals. They show up in speeches from the throne when parties are elected. They become part of, economic updates and budgets. They become part of mandate instructions over to ministers. Like, these are serious documents that actually create to-do lists for government. So I guess I get concerned when parties demonstrate that, we hadn't really figured it all out in April. We still haven't really figured it out, but it's in there now. So I guess I'll vote for us and we'll figure it out later.
Yeah. All right. And so we've got one more party here. What is it about the NDP that you think is going to be a challenge to implement?
Yeah. God, what is that? The Paul Wells thing about, like, if you run for leader of the official opposition, you get the job. If you run, that kind of thing.
That's second or third Wells rule.
I think that there is something with the NDP platform that maybe they feel a bit freer because they're reasonably clear in saying they're not running to form government. They're running to hold whatever government is going to be formed to account, right? And try and nudge them along particular policy directions. So I guess I take their platform not so much as a plan for governing as so much as a plan for opposing, advocating, that kind of thing.
Pushing government in a direction.
Yeah. So they have brought back a promise that they put in their 2019 election campaign with a little bit of amendment. And this is the proposal to introduce an annual net wealth tax in Canada. So, right. As you know, we have a system of personal taxation that largely is based on income with some, some consumption tax on the side. And there are a couple of challenges with the wealth tax as they've proposed it. In terms of implementation. First of all, look, the spirit of saying we have wealth inequality in this country and we should do something about it. Okay. Not going to disagree with that at all. It's just a question of, is this the right way to go about it? So first of all, we've got to define net wealth. Okay. So the net is one of the tricky parts, right? It's not just all of the monies that you have in your, your various fancy accounts. If you fall into the 10 million in net worth or above, as the NDP is saying, which, by the way, is a slight change because in 2019 they were saying it was only 20 million or above. So they've lowered the threshold a little bit here to cover more families, bring in more revenue, and at least in theory on paper.
Yeah.
But because it's net, it's like it's all of your assets less all of your debts. Right. So if you are, for example, a member of the Trump family, you might engage in some tricky asset valuation in order to reduce your net wealth. The next thing that's a bit of a challenge is the inclusion of some assets, like, for example, retirement savings, like RRSPs and pensions. So you get into issues around potential for double taxation. There can be significant assets particularly in defined benefit plans, rather than defined contribution plans. But the whole idea of providing favorable tax treatment to them now, pre-retirement, is that ostensibly you're being taxed on them in retirement when you draw down the asset, right? So you get into sticky issues around potential for double taxation. This is also going to be true in terms of the integration with capital gains and the harmonization with corporate income tax as well. So there's lots of like sticky tax stuff about what's in, what's out. Another real challenge here is that the NDP has definitely taken this model from American economists, Gabriel Zucman and Emmanuel Saez, who say, you got to tax the whole family, right? Because otherwise you get this problem of sprinkling, right? Like, and
it seems to me that is unfeasible in our system because we tax individuals. We don't have household taxation like they do in the US.
Well, and even in the US, it's optional joint taxation. You can elect to file jointly with a spouse or not, but they don't tax family units, whereas Saez and Zucman are saying like, no, count the kids. Like, right? Like everybody's in, because otherwise you have, millionaires engaging in, or billionaires, basically in sort of sprinkling, okay, you take this asset, register it in your name, and then it's off my books kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that gets into really problematic issues in harmonization with our tax system, because who's actually part of what tax unit? All of the modeling that has been done in the PBO for the NDP plan is based on a concept of economic family, which says if you live with somebody that you're related to by blood, adoption, or marriage, you're part of the same economic family. So two siblings living together form an economic family. And this gets into really weird territory around whose money is it and who controls and makes decisions with it, right? So once you start forcing people into families and assuming that they all share resources, like that has some real potential problematic impacts intergenerationally, by gender, in terms of cultural expectations, right?
Yeah.
So that's hugely problematic. And the last thing here, so the nice thing about our income tax system, look, it's imperfect in lots of different ways, but one of the nice things about it is that we're getting better at third-party reporting. So it's getting harder and harder for people to just not report certain forms of income, whether that's investment income or employment income, that kind of thing. I mean, look, there's still more work to be done on this. We don't really have any of that in terms of third-party reporting for assets or debts in this country. So this is potentially really problematic for implementation. I don't see a straightforward way that anytime soon CRA would be ready and able. Even if we solve the definition of wealth, even if we solve the definition of the unit of taxation, fundamentally, I don't know how CRA is going to be able to say who is in the unit of the 10 million and up that has to pay this and on what.
Yeah. And not only that, but their PBO modeling shows that they can do this in the first year. And in order to build the system to do that, that's got to take at least 2, maybe 3 years.
There's a really nice disclaimer in the PBO modeling that basically says, we don't really know about the CRA's capacity to implement this. We've had to make certain assumptions, right? Yeah. And that's huge.
That's an assumption.
It's a big assumption. It's a really big assumption, right?
Yeah.
And again, this goes into that whole turf of like, look, the PBO is just takers from the parties in terms of their policy ideas. They don't tell them, that's not possible. CRA could never do that. They just go like, okay, you want CRA to do it in the first year? Okay, well, we'll put that in the model then.
Yeah, and that's been one of my concerns with having the PBO do platform costing, but that's kind of a separate story for another day. But all right, well, thanks so much for taking us through this and for giving us some thoughts as to things we should be thinking about when we're reading the platforms in terms of is this feasible? And I think that's a valuable exercise that we should be engaging in. So thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you.
And we'll do this again soon sometime.
That would be great. That'd be
Great,
great.
thanks.
Okay,
and that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.